The Power Hour with John Lee.
Welcome to the Power Hour. Back in the house again, back in the studio today. Now today we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories and where the term comes from and why it's so popular. So everybody, we hear this term conspiracy theory all the time, and really it doesn't mean what it used to mean. And what I'm talking about that is I'm referring to, as George Orwell said, first they steal the words and then they steal the meaning. So a conspiracy theory really is that you believe two or more people have planned something nefarious or illegal, and you have a theory about that. This is what the police do every day. If they think two or three people robbed the bank, this guy, and this guy, and they have a theory about who did it and how they did it, that's a theory. And it's a theory about a conspiracy because the three people conspired in their planning to rob the bank. So there are actually millions and millions of conspiracy theories around the world, and many of them are absolutely true. In the end, it turns out those three people did rob the bank, and the theory that the police had was correct, and many of the people in the area knew exactly who did it because their theory was correct. Well, it's probably this guy, and this guy. So why does it mean something different now? When we hear the words conspiracy theory, is that what we think about investigative techniques, or do we think about something else? And I suggest that it has become a synonym of crazy fantasy. So if you say to somebody, oh, that's a crazy fantasy, it's the same as saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, and vice versa. So really, as Orwell said, they have taken the words and changed the meaning and weaponized it. So we're going to go back and find out, where did this come from? So where did we first start hearing this expression, conspiracy theory, and when? If you don't know, the answer is in the 1960s. So it's that old. It's not a new phenomenon. I think it's internationalized over the last decade or so, with social media and English being such a dominant language. There are people around the world who know that expression, who can't even speak English, but they can say conspiracy theory. So it's what we call pernicious. But you have to go back to the 1960s to understand that expression as a mechanism. How does it work? Well, it discredits the person that you say it to. It's an insult, basically, to the person's intelligence. You say, what you're saying is that this person is unable to distinguish between logical, possible reality and fact and ridiculous and fanciful invention. And very often they do it probably for their own entertainment. Are there people like that in the world? Yes, of course there are. Everything that happens is because of, the Catholic Church, or it's because of MI5 or the Israeli Mossad. There are people who invent theories for everything. But we'll go back to the origin. 1960s, what do we find? We find a country of people in the United States who had absolutely no trust in government. I mean, obviously there were people who trusted government, but there were several movements at the time, cultural changes that were happening in America in the 1960s, in that period. And so, I mean, you can look to the hippies immediately. Very anti-establishment, very anti-authoritarian, anti-war, massive movement, millions of people involved in that. And of course you had the Black Panthers, and you had the civil rights movement, and you had feminism, and then on the other side, of course, you had the Ku Klux Klan and traditionalists. So this was a nation at war with itself culturally. And there were four main protagonists in the cultural arena at this time that were powerful in the sense that they were famous, that they were popular, and that they represented a real threat to what we call the establishment, the old order, the power structure, the way things work, and the people involved in that. Those interested in keeping things the way they are, even when things are really bad for the majority of the population. That's what we call the establishment, or at least that's my description of it. Those four men, because of course this was a very, very much a male-dominated society in the 60s. So you're talking about John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. And you can have them in any order you want. So what did they have in common? What I said, they were dangerous to society and they were very popular. But specifically, they were very anti-war. They were young, and they knew what they believed. They had a real belief system. They represented the vanguard, or a new generation of thinkers, and they were born into, or they arrived at a period when everything was going global. People were getting televisions. Cinema was becoming more popular. The music industry was booming around the world. We were creating icons all the time. And so they became icons. They became cultural icons very quickly, and the faces became known very quickly. And you could see them on television, hear them on the radio, see them in the newspaper. So there was a lot more information flow happening in the beginning of the 60s, when you consider that the Second World War ended in 1945. 10 years later, you've got Elvis Presley. It's a direct reaction. You lose an entire generation of people to war. The next generation wants parties, music, and an opportunity to enjoy their life. And that's why you saw the explosion of rock and roll and things like that. And part of that was these new icons, these political icons that I mentioned. And the unifying truth about the four men that I've mentioned, I think, is that they were all assassinated. And not just assassinated, but shot to death. And they were all shot to death in public. They were all public executions of the most famous people in the world, the most famous and highly protected people in the world. And they were shot to death, executed, as I say, publicly, in less than 5 years. So in less than 5 years, the four most powerful political revolutionaries in the United States of America were all publicly executed. And what are we told about that? Well, we're told that each of these crimes was committed by people who didn't know each other. There was no relationship between the perpetrators. So each crime was committed by a different person that had no connection whatsoever to the other perpetrators of the crimes that I've mentioned. So we're talking about individuals. So the basic story, we'll start with John F. Kennedy. Right? What's the basic story there? Well, he was killed, he was assassinated, shot in the head by Lee Harvey Oswald. One guy killed Kennedy, and then a few days later, he was killed. Again, public execution with a gun. He was killed by Jack Ruby in Dallas Police Station on live television. He was killed. And then Jack Ruby, of course, disappeared into the prison system. So that's the story that we're told about John F. Kennedy. So, it's like a word association game. JFK, Lee Harvey Oswald. Case closed, move along. And then we come to the next case. So that was it's November the 22nd of 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. Then we jump forward a couple of years, 1965, Malcolm X. Malcolm X is killed. And he is shot to death in public. He's giving a speech in a theatre, and a guy called Thomas Hagen stands up in the front row, pulls out a shotgun, and shoots Malcolm X. Now, imagine that for the people there. I won't go too much into it now, but Malcolm X was extremely famous. There's obviously a very famous film. I think it's Denzel Washington who plays the part of Malcolm X. So for Malcolm X to be assassinated like that while giving a speech was a major event at the time. And Thomas Hagen disappears into the prison system. Then we've got Martin Luther King, the leader of the civil rights movement, one of the most famous people, obviously, of the 20th century, and a tremendous orator, a really amazing speaker. If you haven't listened to any Martin Luther King speeches or read anything that he's written, I would recommend it to you. And he was shot and killed by a guy called James Earl Ray. That's his name, James Earl Ray. So this, again, public execution. Martin Luther King walks out of his motel room with a group of security guards, professional security personnel. And James Earl Ray is waiting in a house, a boarding house, so he's renting a room, directly facing Martin Luther King's room. He walks out with all his security guards around him, and he's shot in the face. James Earl Ray shoots him in the face, and eventually is caught. And this is well, I say eventually. It took a long time. We'll leave it there for the moment. But he was caught, and he disappeared into the prison system. All right, okay. And then, of course, we get Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who was running for president at the time in 1968, 2 months after Martin Luther King was assassinated. The last one, really, of the four was Robert Kennedy. And he was the last hope for many people as well because of these assassinations. And Robert Kennedy was doing very well in the election process. He was going to become the nominee for the presidential race. He's going to be the representative of the Democratic Party in the nomination, in the election. And he was giving a speech because he just won a particular vote in California, I think it was. And he's in a hotel and he's up on the stage, he's giving a speech in public. And there's a lot of people with him and around him. Obviously one of the most highly protected people in the world, especially considering that 8 years before this, his brother was the president and he was shot and killed in public. And when he finished his speech, he was shot and killed. In public, he was executed, another public execution, this time by a Lebanese American called Sirhan Sirhan. And then Sirhan was arrested and disappeared into the prison system. So when we look at these people, we look at Lee Harvey Oswald, we look at Thomas Hagen, we look at James Earl Ray, and we look at Sirhan Sirhan, the perpetrators of these crimes, and we're told there is no connection between any of them. I mean, you can look and see, did they know each other? Did they belong to the same club or political party or whatever? No, not really. There doesn't seem to be much connection between them, but there are some commonalities. One being that none of them had any experience of assassinations. They had never assassinated anybody. They weren't professional assassins. Another being that they hadn't tried to assassinate their target and failed, and then come back and done it successfully. They did it successfully the first time. Another being that they had no help from anybody. They acted alone. And Thomas Hagen had a couple of guys with him that were also pulled out guns and shot Malcolm X, but there was no team, there was no coordination, there was no conspiracy to kill any of these men. They all acted alone in that sense, the assassins. And the other obvious commonality is that they all successfully executed the most heavily protected men on earth, and they did it in public. The first time, as I say, with no help from anybody, and no practice or experience of even trying to assassinate anyone. So this is why many people at the time were creating conspiracy theories in the true sense of the word or the expression. So they had theories at the time about what was happening because people weren't as indoctrinated to television in the 60s as they are now. So television was relatively new at this point. Many people didn't even have a television, you know. Certainly didn't have a television in every room. And so when every couple of years when one of these top revolutionaries gets, you know, publicly executed in this way, people were just not buying the lone gunman scenario. This is one person who's just a bit crazy and was able to do something incredible. And people weren't believing that. They were saying, no, I don't believe that. I think it was the CIA and the mafia, or it was Fidel Castro and the mafia, or it was Fidel Castro and the CIA, some combination of these dark entities, as you might describe them. But certainly a team of people, some coordination, some military involvement, not just one guy every time, you know, and he's either dead or disappears into the prison system. So people just weren't buying it. They were asking a lot of very uncomfortable questions, and questions that didn't produce satisfactory answers. And we'll look at the stories of each individual and what actually happened, or what the story is, the official story is, and what's wrong with those stories. And because people were developing their own theories and not just repeating what they saw on television at that time, this became a problem. This was an inconvenience for the establishment in America, because it's very difficult to control the narrative, to tell people what reality is when they don't believe you, when they don't trust anything you say. And they're asking you questions about your story that you can't answer. So this became a real problem, and it exposed the kind of duopoly that we see in politics around the world, but especially in America, where you've got two political parties and very little difference in terms of ideology. And so that's why people were very disconnected from electoral politics, as we call it, at that time. So they decided that anybody who had questions about any of these events or any other events was a conspiracy theorist. And they weaponized that term. As George Orwell said, first they steal the words and then they steal the meaning. So conspiracy theory became a synonym of crazy fantasy. Not what it literally means, a theory about conspiracy. Much like, for example, the intelligence community. This does not mean that the people in that community are intelligent. Intelligence has now been used as a synonym of stolen information. So they are spy agencies, the CIA and the NSA and MI5 and Mossad. These are spies, and the information they have has been obtained through illicit means, covert means, and so they call that intelligence because it sounds a lot nicer and better than what it really is. So let's look at the situation with JFK. What happened there? Did Lee Harvey Oswald, on his own, go up to a window? Well, first he got a job there. He was actually working there in the Texas Book Depository. And he went up to the window, and this is the official story. He was waiting in the window. JFK drives past. John F. Kennedy. He drives past in his car with his wife and some other dignitaries. And he is shot in the face. Right? There are several shots. And you can watch what's called the Zapruder film and see it for yourself. The man gets shot in the face. And Lee Harvey Oswald is behind him. And if you try to shoot somebody in the face from behind, you'll find out that you can't. Bullets just don't work like that. But we've got a news report from the time, and it's a guy called Dan Rather who was on the television for decades. He was institutional in the United States, and he's talking about the Zapruder film, which is key evidence in the case, and he has been allowed to view it, and then he's telling the public what he's seen. So, Johnny, give us the news report, please, mate.
The films we saw were taken by an amateur photographer who had a particularly good vantage point just past the building from which the fatal shot was fired. The films show President Kennedy's open black limousine making a left turn off Houston Street onto Elm Street on the fringe of downtown Dallas. A left turn made just below the window in which the assassin was waiting. About 35 yards past the very base of the building, just below the window, President Kennedy could be seen to put his right hand up to the side of his head to either brush back his hair or perhaps rub his eyebrow. President Kennedy was sitting on the same side of the car as the building from which the shot came. Mrs. Kennedy was by his side. In the jump seat in front of them, Mrs. Connolly and Governor Connolly. Governor Connolly on the same side of the car as the president, and in the front seat, 2 Secret Service men. Just as the president put that right hand up to the side of his head, you could see him lurch forward. The first shot had hit him.
So, as you can see there in that clip, Dan Rather is telling the public the opposite of the truth. If you watch the Zapruder film, which you can, it's on YouTube. I'm not going to show it on the Power Hour today because it's graphic. Somebody getting shot in the face in front of the wife, and a lot of other people as well. So you might not want to watch it, but if you've seen it or you've seen the film JFK, they show it many times in the film. Oliver Stone directed it, and many times you see back and to the left, back and to the left. He gets shot in the face. But Lee Harvey Oswald was apparently behind him, so the story makes no sense from the very beginning. And Dan Rather in that clip is lying. He says that you can see his head move violently forward. No, you don't. You see his head fly violently backwards, the opposite of what he says. It's quite clearly visible that he's not telling the truth. So, what's the lie from Dan Rather? That he's seen the film when he hasn't, or that JFK was shot from the back when he wasn't. He was shot from the front. See, the film was taken to, I think it was Time Life magazine. Private company kept that film for many years, so the public didn't see it. They had to believe what Dan Rather was telling them on the news, and say, right, okay, this is what happened because this newsman is telling us that that's what happened. In fact, it's the inversion of that. And around the same time, a lot of doctors who obviously didn't receive the script, they were telling the truth. And you can watch them, you can see them on YouTube, the doctors at the hospital talking about literally doing this, where he got shot in the head. They're literally saying, look, yeah, this is where he got shot. But by the time Dan Rather got back to the studio, they changed the narrative. And that's what had happened. He'd been shot in the back of the head because Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be behind him. So in my mind, either he watched the film, saw JFK get shot in the face, and was told to lie about it. Now it's a conspiracy. Just with that, it's already a conspiracy. Or he didn't watch the film, and he was just told what to say. Say you've watched the film and describe it like this. In either case, he's not telling the truth. That's demonstrable. So he's not a journalist, and he's not a reporter. He's not reporting what happened. So you have to ask yourself, what is his job? Because he is getting paid, but he's not getting paid to do what we think he's doing, which is reporting the news. He's getting paid to do something totally different, which is to tell everybody the opposite of what really happened. And that's clearly visible, as I say. So after Lee Harvey Oswald has successfully assassinated the most heavily protected man in the world in a totally impossible way, he leaves the area unobstructed. Nobody stops him. Nobody asks him anything. No questions. The police don't interfere with his movements at all. He leaves the area with no problems. So at this point, nobody's saying Lee Harvey Oswald. Nobody knew anything about Lee Harvey Oswald. He wasn't a suspect. Nobody's looking for him. Nobody suspects him. He wasn't under investigation for that crime. Nobody knew really what was happening. And he was able to leave the area. So he left the area. Now he could just go home. Go home, have a cup of tea, watch television and relax, because nobody was looking for him. But instead of that, he decides to approach a young police officer called Kyle Tippett in broad daylight, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the afternoon, in a residential area, and shoot Kyle Tippett in the head. Now remember, Lee Harvey Oswald didn't know John F. Kennedy, and he's just killed him. And now he doesn't know this cop either, and he's just killed him as well. But absolutely no strategic reason. And must be a strategic thinker if you're going to eliminate the President of the United States. But instead of going home, he decides to commit a completely needless and illogical murder in broad daylight. And then when he's finished that, he goes to the cinema. Well, I've killed a couple of guys already today that I didn't know, so I think I'll go to the cinema. And when he gets to the cinema, he's got money in his pocket, but he doesn't pay. So he goes into the cinema for free. He goes in without paying, and he's seen doing so. And the people at the cinema who work there, I don't know what their security procedures were, but they phoned the police to say, look, there's a guy who's just come into the cinema for nothing. You're talking 1963, so I don't know, 30 cents maybe to go in the cinema at that time to watch a matinee. So they phone the police, and the police react in a very strange way, because during an investigation as to who has just assassinated John F. Kennedy, you would imagine that the police in the area would be extremely busy and that resources would be tight. But actually, just based on a phone call saying some man has walked into the cinema without paying, they sent, I don't know if it's 12, 14, 16, you can see for yourself on the internet, on YouTube, you can actually watch it, you can look at the pictures. Loads of police cars, loads of cops down to the cinema because somebody's gone in there without paying. So somebody made a very strange decision there. I'm going to, okay, on one hand, either a person or a group of people or persons has just killed John F. Kennedy, but there's a guy watching a film that he hasn't paid to watch. Let's send, a large section of our police force down to that cinema to make sure this guy pays to watch this film. I mean, that again, this is one of the problematic elements. It's all problematic. It's not a good story. This is where the problems began for them, because the story's not good. Then they've arrested him for what? They've arrested him for going into the cinema without paying. Okay. So then they've got him in custody, and they put him on television a few times, make sure everybody sees his face. He's asked if he's killed the president. He says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't been arrested for that. They said something about a policeman, but I don't know what they're talking about. I need a lawyer. Can someone come and represent me? Innocent until proven guilty. And Wikipedia, you should be ashamed of yourselves, because Wikipedia will tell you that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy, and that's a fact. No, it's not. Innocent until proven guilty. The man had no trial, no defence, no prosecution, no judge, no jury. Therefore, legally, he is innocent. He is innocent. But Wikipedia would like you to think that it's a fact that Lee Harvey Oswald is guilty. Not true. So after a couple of days of this, they're walking Lee Harvey Oswald through the police station in Dallas. And a guy called Jack Ruby steps out of the crowd with a gun, a revolver, and shoots Lee Harvey Oswald twice, quick succession, bang, bang, on live television. Again, public execution, on television, in front of loads of people. There seems to be a common denominator, a connector, a thread. Public execution again. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald is dead. Jack Ruby didn't know John F. Kennedy and didn't know Lee Harvey Oswald. But he's somehow managed to enter a police station with a gun and execute the most high-profile prisoner in the world in front of 30 cops on live television. Right. I mean, obviously there are several problems with that. How the hell do you get into a police station with a gun under those circumstances? Why wasn't he protected properly, etc.? I mean, you know, obvious common sense questions there. Who was Jack Ruby? Well, Jack Ruby was a gangster. His real name was Jacob Rubenstein. And the only reason he wasn't a full member of the mafia is because he was Jewish. Hence the name Jacob Rubenstein. He anglicised it in a way and called himself Jack Ruby. But he was in every other way a member of the mafia. He had nightclubs and he ran prostitution rackets, totally involved in all aspects of mafia life and corrupt politicians and corrupt police officers, their activities down in New Orleans, where it has been shown that Jack Ruby actually knew Lee Harvey Oswald, which is another problem in the official story, the official narrative. Yeah, they actually knew each other. Plenty of witnesses to that. So after the JFK murder, there were a lot more questions than answers. And then Malcolm X. Well, what's problematic with Malcolm X? Well, Malcolm X was a prominent member of the Nation of Islam. He thought that Christianity was a white man's religion and that Islam was basically a better fit for him. And the reason he was called Malcolm X is because his real name was Malcolm Little, but Little was a slave name. It was a name that was given to his ancestors by the owner, by the slave owner, whose name was Little. So they all got the same name as the slave owner when they arrived with African names. So that's why the Malcolm X and many others used that methodology. They used X as their name because they wouldn't use the slave name that was given to them, which in this case was Little. So he after a very difficult life, some time in prison, became a superstar. He was like the Black John Lennon with no guitar. Everybody was listening to Malcolm X. As I say, there's a film, I think it's Denzel Washington who plays the part of Malcolm X. And he was advocating segregation, actually. He wasn't like Martin Luther King advocating integration. He was talking about segregation. They say there is no way Thomas Hagen could get in there because he was known to be an enemy of Malcolm X. Not that they had a really close personal relationship, but just that Malcolm X was a visible enemy of their leader. And so there is no way Thomas Hagen was getting in there. He was literally on the list of people who are not getting in. Not only was Thomas Hagen able to get into the building through the front door, is the way the story is told. He went through the front door where you've got big guys checking everybody. You're not coming in, you're not coming in, and neither are you. And if you are coming in, we're going to know exactly what you've got in your pockets. Thomas Hagen, who's literally on the list of people who can't come in, manages to walk through the front door with a shotgun and then sits in the front row. So he's got front row seats. If you're Malcolm X and you look down and you see one of your known enemies sitting in the front row, you might suspect there's a problem. And then when he stands up and pulls out a shotgun, well, tragically, you know there's a problem. And the saddest part, I think, is that possibly the saddest part was that his wife and kids, Malcolm X's wife and kids, were sitting there and they saw what happened, and he was publicly executed. And he died on the stage. Now, obviously, and then Thomas Hagen disappeared into the criminal justice system, if that's what it is. And there's a couple of other guys with him there as well that were also carrying guns and also shot Malcolm X. And there's no real explanation of how they were able to get in. So that's a problematic story in itself as well. And now we're into April. I mean, I don't know what month it was, actually, to be fair. Of 1965. Well, it's approximately, 18 months. I think it was early 1965. So approximately 18 months after John F. Kennedy was killed. Jump forward to 1968, what happens? Martin Luther King. He's assassinated by James Earl Ray. Again, not an assassin. Small-time, pathetic criminal who, for example, tried to do a robbery and shot himself. He was doing another robbery and he fell out of his own car. This is not a master criminal by any stretch of the imagination. All of the police that were assigned to protect Martin Luther King, because he was in Memphis, he's in the Deep South in the 60s, he's a civil rights leader. This is not, the best place for him to be. But the day before he was killed, all the police pulled back, they call it. They moved away, they left him basically. And he walked out, and they also changed his room to a much more vulnerable spot. And then he walked out. James Earl Ray didn't know him at all, shot him and killed him. And then got his gun and some other incriminating evidence with his fingerprints all over it and all that, and put all this stuff in a bag and ran out the door, his front door of the boarding house where he was staying, and dropped the bag in the doorway. Just a bag of evidence pointing directly to him. And then he jumped in a car and drove away seconds before the police arrived. Now you might think, why didn't he just jump in the car with the bag and drive away with the evidence and not leave the evidence behind? Good question. But that's what he chose to do, apparently. He chose to escape, but leave plenty of evidence pointing directly to him because he had a criminal record. So his fingerprints were on file and they just identified him immediately. But he was somehow, even though he had no money, he was able to travel all over the place. The guy was in Canada, he was in Mexico, various different identities, passports, driving licenses. And this is supposed to be just one low intellect person who was able to obtain all these different IDs, real high quality fake passports and all that. And he was eventually arrested after having facial reconstructive surgery in the 60s. This man had no money. He was eventually arrested in London. And he was trying to get a flight, I think, to Belgium. But he was arrested in London anyway. And there was no way that he could have paid for any of this. And if you look into the other cases as well, especially Lee Harvey Oswald and the way he travelled around the world, a similar story. No way he could have paid for that. So he gets arrested in London and goes to prison. Unfortunately for the storytellers, in a trial a few years later, it was proven that the gun that was apparently used to kill Martin Luther King, that was left in the bag by him, was not the murder weapon. That was proven in court by experts, in a court of law. It was proven and demonstrated that's not the gun that killed him. So that has no evidentiary value at all. And another man who was completely disconnected from James Earl Ray was convicted of the crime in the 70s. He was convicted of killing Martin Luther King. And it was concluded in the case that he was probably working with members of the government, probably CIA. That is an official court conclusion of a jury after viewing the evidence. Right. So you would imagine that James Earl Ray would get a new trial and would probably be released from prison. Never happened. He died in prison. Again, many problems with that. Robert Kennedy, now the most protected man on earth because his brother was killed. His brother was the president. He was killed. He was executed publicly. And now Robert Kennedy is trying to be the president. He's a candidate for the presidency. And, his brother was killed, so let's protect him. You would imagine that it'd be very, very difficult to get anywhere near Robert Kennedy. And, of course, he was executed in public again, this time by a Lebanese American called Sirhan Sirhan, who apparently, according to the story, walked up behind him, put a gun to the back of his head, in front of all his security staff and everybody, and the people who worked in the hotel, and the crowd that were actually, at the event, and shot him, I think, twice in the head. And another guy got shot as well. And there are so many problems with that story. I mean, all the eyewitnesses said that Sirhan Sirhan was nowhere near him. Yeah, they did see him with a gun, but he was several feet away from him. He wasn't right behind him. And not just that during their encounter, Sirhan Sirhan was looking at him. They were face to face. He was never behind him at any point. And they found far more bullets at the scene than could have been held in the gun of Sirhan Sirhan. And just the basic idea that this guy could walk up to Robert Francis Kennedy and execute him in public with no opposition at all. Nobody even tried to stop him. And they certainly didn't stop him. And Robert Kennedy died. So that is a brief summary of what happened to the four most powerful and famous political rebels in the 1960s. They were all publicly executed in extremely problematic ways in terms of logistics and the story itself, and whether or not it actually makes any sense. And when four of them have been killed, people start saying, now these are not random crimes. This is probably one group of people who is capable of committing these crimes and is killing the people who pose a danger to the establishment. Military, CIA, people who've got their own theories about this. But it's much easier, or it certainly was much easier in the 60s for people to form their own opinions and say, nah, I don't believe this. Another lone gunman, another crazy guy just out to kill people, manages to assassinate this person. No, we don't believe it. We think it's one organisation, probably the CIA, who's killing them all. They're killing them all. And so this conspiracy theory was disseminated in the media to describe crazy fantasy. Anybody who suggests anything different from what we say, from what the politicians say on television, or what the news presenters say, or anything like that, they are conspiracy theories, and we need to ridicule them. And it became weaponized because nobody was believing the stories, and people were saying, no, I don't believe that. I think there are more people involved. Okay, then it's a conspiracy. Yeah, it's a theory. Yeah, so it's a conspiracy theory. Yeah, okay, then you're crazy. And that's basically what they did. So they changed the meaning in that sense from a theory about a conspiracy to being a fantasy. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for anyone who likes to think and form their own conclusions and ask questions and look for details, is that the term itself, conspiracy theory, imploded, or has imploded over the last few years. So they've actually used it so much that they lost the ability to use it anymore, because they made it a synonym of crazy fantasy. And that's why we suddenly were introduced ad nauseum to the term collusion. When many of the major news outlets and organizations in America were telling the world that Donald Trump was basically working for Vladimir Putin. He was an employee of Vladimir Putin. And they were also coordinating with Julian Assange of WikiLeaks to steal the election. Basically, Donald Trump was a Russian spy, and so was Julian Assange. And they all worked for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin and all that. They literally couldn't use the word conspiracy, because they contaminated it so much that if they said, oh, there's a conspiracy between Vladimir Putin, people would automatically associate the word conspiracy with crazy fantasy. So they literally couldn't use it. They couldn't say conspiracy tonight on CNN, because that would actually, in this case, be very honest, because it was a theory. They had this conspiracy theory, a real conspiracy theory, a theory about a conspiracy between Putin, Trump, and Assange. Three totally disconnected people. But anyway, we'll just say that we've got no evidence, we've got no proof, we've got no records of it, we can't demonstrate it. No one can. In the end, the Mueller report found nothing. If any of these people are completely innocent, I don't know. But they found nothing, they demonstrated nothing, proved nothing. And they couldn't say, tonight, our conspiracy theory is, or tonight, the conspiracy. They couldn't use the word. So they started using the word collusion. And if you Google it, Google the word collusion, and then you'll get a description of it. Look at synonyms. And one of the first ones there is conspiracy. It's a direct synonym of the word conspiracy. And there was even a book written called Collusion. A book written by a guy called Luke Harding, an English guy that writes for The Guardian. And by all accounts, I haven't actually read it myself. I wouldn't dignify it, to be honest, by reading it. But by all accounts, it's a terrible book with zero evidence. And I've seen him in it giving a lengthy interview about the book, in which he was completely unable to provide any evidence at all. The only thing he could say was that Donald Trump was in Moscow in 1986 with doing the Miss World competition, which he owned. He was the owner of it. And because he was in Moscow in 1986, that means he's a Russian spy in 2017. So bad luck for any of you people that went to the World Cup in Russia, because if you try to do anything important in 20 years, they can prove that you went to Russia at some point in your life, and therefore you're probably a Russian spy. So now they have a a problem again where they've spent so long with these conspiracy theories, and that's what they really are, about Russia, that we're seeing on the other side now, not just the Democrats saying that Vladimir Putin is trying to steal the election and give the White House to Donald Trump, but now the Republicans and Donald Trump and his people, they're saying that the Russians are actually trying to steal the election and give it to the Democrats. So now you've got all these conspiracy theories that they're just throwing back and forth like a tennis ball, and people are in the middle and they don't know what to believe. So actually the term itself has imploded and lost its original meaning and the meaning that they gave to it. So the next time you hear the term conspiracy theory, just try to remember what conspiracy theory actually means, and the lengths that certain people went to pervert the meaning of the term, and maybe even think about why. Fabian, let's go to the music. Thank you for joining us here on the Power Hour.